Light then. Lighting strategies, rather, as it relates to the scale of the objects in our scene or how we perceive them to be, as opposed to light, which can provide shadows, and shadows, as you can see here, can also contribute to the geometric composition of the scene. But that's a slightly different topic, and we'll come to that later. But let's just consider what light can do to tell us about the size of the thing in our scenes. Now, the sun is large, but in the default Bryce render settings in the default Bryce scene, the sun is treated as a single point light source. So the shadows are exceedingly sharp. Now, though the sun is a large object in the solar system, as a proportion of the total sky, it only occupies a very small proportion of the sky. So when compared with large objects like mountains, you don't really need to think about soft shadows. But if the sun is lighting a scene and the objects are small in that scene, then the size of the sun as it appears in the sky compared with the size of the objects you've got on the ground will result in visible soft shadows. So that's the first thing to say, is if you're lighting a scene with the sun and it's supposed to look realistic, if the things in your scene are supposed to be small, then you can have soft shadows. You might also consider other lighting environments where you've got multiple light sources, and then you've got to think about the size of those light sources, like a light bulb, compared with the objects that you're trying to portray. And if the objects are small compared with your light source, then you will expect soft shadows, and you could use multiple light sources to generate that effect, or soft shadow effects. Since we're dealing with basics here, let's just deal with the sun. We'll consider our two extremes, that what we're looking at is very small and what we're looking at is very large. We'll start with small. So I'm going to move the camera up as per the other videos and back, and I'm going to narrow the field of view. I'm going to move our alien guy so that he's in the middle of this and looking up at us perhaps, and then move the camera around a bit more. So I'm just setting this up for the situation where things are small. Compositionally, you ought to really also consider what your aspect ratio of your scene is going to be. So you can have square, portrait, landscape, something appropriate to your scene rather than just stick with the default. So I'm going for square in this case, and here's our little alien man, and as things stand, the lighting is quite basic and it's very difficult to determine what's going on in this scene. So let us, to start with then, set up our depth of field, because that's going to help us determine what's close to the camera and further away. So I'll just get rid of Vicky because we don't need her in this. I'll get rid of her altogether, and then I'll switch to where our scene is. That's our eyes of our alien man. See if we can find him. There we go, here's his eyes. And then we go render options, premium effects, and raise per pixel 4. To get soft shadows working in premium effects, you need soft shadows selected here, and you also need to set it in your light sources. Premium effect render engine is different from the previous 3 render engines, and so you'll find that if you set your soft shadows up in regular and then switch to premium and you check this, soft shadows are still going to look slightly different. So it's always a good idea to decide on what render engine you're going to use. Now, since I'm using depth of field, I'm using the premium effect one. So I'll set my focal length to the current selection, and we'll see whether things are going in or out of focus at the moment. So you can see we need a larger lens radius because you can barely see the depth of field effect there. So back into render options, and I'll take that up to 1 and see whether we can see any depth of field effect. Okay, so now we're getting some depth of field effect, so that's helping establish that thing's further away there. This is more or less in focus, his eyes are in focus, his feet are further away. That's probably enough for that. Now, the lighting situation. Generally with still lifes you need quite sophisticated lighting, and at the moment I've got the Bryce sun and I've got this sky dome that I created, and it's not even casting shadows. But actually that could be quite handy, because what I'm going to do is use obscure lighting, which provides very good shadow simulation, and support it with the Bryce sun, which I'm going to soften. So I'll set the softening of the sun up straight away, and you'll be able to see the effect of that in our render. So there we go, we've got soft shadows from our main light source. Now I'm going to go back in here, image-based lighting, think about what I'm going to do with this. I think I'm going to want a complete HDRI of the sky, but I don't want the sun to be captured in that. So if I turn the sun off as a visible object, go back to IBL, don't select use sky dome, do use sky. That gives me a complete blue a 360 degree by 180 degree HDRI to provide a light source, and the sunlight's automatically disabled. I'll leave that so for now. To set up obscure lighting, I need light from inside. I don't need shadow casting, so that's great. I've not selected that. I don't need true ambience optimization. I don't need specular output. I do need to include only the background, because we're going to put a special light source in to light this scene and provide the ambient light in this scene. So I'm going to check out of that now, go to create a radial light, change the family view grouping to orange so I can see it's not an ordinary light. Go into attributes and call this background, so that allows my HDRI to target the surface of this sphere, and modify it so it's true ambience optimized. Use gel, include only background. In procedural, select default grey. That's a surface that's going to be lit with the HDRI from the inside. It's not providing any light itself, it's just distributing it in a way for the true ambience effect to pick up. Enlarge it so it encompasses my scene, and go into render options and select true ambience, scatter correction, boost light, and lower the maximum ray depth to 4 for efficiency. This process is all covered in other videos. We're just setting things up here. So has that worked, or have I missed something? There's a little bit of light there. I can just make out his eyes. So what I need to do is provide a bit more light from this effect. So we'll try 300, which is quite a bit more. So you see in this include thing, it's only lighting the background, so nothing else is getting lit from the inside. And okay, we've got some light there, and it's quite blue, as you might expect. And this high quality of ambient light simulation, although it looks very grainy because we've got 4 rays per pixel, is going to tell us a lot about the relationship between these shapes, which otherwise we're losing. Because of our camera view, we've got no horizon, no sky backdrop. So now I'm going to bring the sunlight back in, and because the light from this is quite blue, I might consider lowering the saturation slightly, and the sun, if I hold the Alt key down, I could change the colour so it's a little bit orangey, which will offset the blue a bit, so we get back to a sort of a white colour. So I'll give it that value, make it a bit orangey. I don't know how strong it's got to be to offset this blue, I'll just guess. So now I've combined these two together. You can see probably got a bit too much sunlight there, it's bleaching our little alien friend out, so I'll cut the sun diffuse value to 50. So we've got that. It's still all looking a bit light possibly there. It's getting closer though. So I'll reduce the HDRI effect by 50, and I think I'm going to increase the lens radius a little bit as well, just to try and establish better. So too light or too dark, that's the question. Close, I suppose, because a lot of these things are diffuse grey, and we're compensating for the fact that his eyes are white. I suppose that's okay. Right, and important to check that we've got full shadow intensity, so none of the sunlight's getting through these objects, and this is just providing our ambient lighting for this scene. So I'll give that a quick render. I've narrowed the field of view still further, so hopefully when this is rendered with a higher quality rays per pixel, then we'll be able to see that this effect is working. So I'll increase the rays per pixel to 256, and I'm going to reduce the document size to 700 by 700 for speed, and we'll see what we've got. Okay, that's going to take 5 minutes. So I'll just let that render in the background, and I'll switch to my other scene. Okay. So in this scene I want to go to the other extreme of having something appear very large in my scene. Previously I'd lowered the camera down, but in this case what I'm going to do is enlarge the objects, because I want to take advantage of haze effect. Now I know strictly speaking that's not light, but it does have the effect of lightening the objects as they go further into the distance. I also need to consider the lighting in this scene. Now in the case where I was trying to make things look small, I used obscure lighting, which is an advanced form of shadow simulation, but I don't really need that for large objects because the conditions are different. Partly because they're going to be hidden in haze, also because we're going to be dealing with a predominant light source, which is the sun, that's going to dominate the scene, and we're not really looking for the finer details of how these are structured. We want just an impression of size, and for that I'm going to use what we've already got built into the scene. I've captured a half sky dome, but I'll turn the shadow casting off just to make rendering a bit more efficient. So I'll turn the shadow casting back on, rendering scene. We've only got 16 simulated light sources there, but that's going to help because it's going to provide a little bit of more complicated shadows in this structure. And I'm just going to check that I've got 100% shadow intensity there. I can turn soft shadows on here, but I don't need to turn it up very high, because if I do, then it won't be appropriate for a large structure. The other thing is, soft shadows is going to slow the render time down quite a bit, but it's only going to apply in this case to the main light source. So on the shadows of this fella here, we might see it on the main light source, but there's no point really in introducing it at this stage because we're still setting things up. So alright, I've got these things, this cube, so I'm going to group them both together, and then I'm going to zoom out and enlarge them still further, and then move them back. Now the effect of enlarging them like this will have the handy effect of placing the horizon quite low with respect to this structure, but as we know, I'll just widen the field of view. Once again, we're looking at large things, wide field of view is suitable. This will mean that our outline is here, so if Vicky was stood next to this, that would be how tall she appeared. In fact, we've still got Vicky in this scene, so before I get rid of her, because I don't think we're going to need her help much longer here, then you can see there she is. So that's now 7 or 8 times her height. Not big enough. But we also have to consider that I'd turned the haze off here, so I want to see, if I turn the haze on, what effect that's having in my scene. So haze effect is still fairly minimal. You can see a bit of it just there. So what I shall do is make this structure even larger. I'll leave Vicky stood there for a while, so make it bigger, and then lift it up like so. So now that's a Vicky height down there, so this is getting to be a significantly large thing. Right, so it's possibly 50 times her height now. We've got our man in the foreground here, this little alien fella. He's going to be left here, and we're going to see if this still looks big by the time I've finished making these adjustments. So now we get rid of Vicky, so that's taken one clue out of there, and now we've just got our light settings and our alien in the foreground. And you can see there's a band here where there's light and then it goes back to fairly dark shadows. This is the height of the haze. So if we want to adjust that, we need to adjust the cloud height. Sometimes adjusting the cloud height though can turn the clouds back on. It's a bit random that. It hasn't in this case, so that's fine. And now you can see that the haze extends upwards, and this is giving us a greater sense of depth. We've got controls on the haze here. We can increase the intensity of the haze, but we've got more sophisticated controls in the Skylab. So go to atmosphere, we've got density and thickness. Now thickness is the uniform absorption from the front of the camera to the back. The density creates a gradient between that. So if we have a high density, moving the thickness will move this wall of haze backwards and forwards, so we can create quite a sharp transition, which can be handy in creating a sense of depth. So there you go. I've got a very high intensity, and then we've got this sense of depth. So this is quite a murky day on whatever planet our little alien lives on, and you can see the render time's quite quick. So it's because we've got grey materials for this structure and they've no bump on them, then we're going to need a fairly high level of quality here, a number of light sources, to get rid of any obvious bands in the shadows there. So that's not really providing very sophisticated shadows, because we've got the dominant light source of the sun, and since the sun was also captured in the HDRI image, we could do away with the sunlight and just rely on the HDRI by providing a bit more light. But in that case, this can be somewhat limiting, because we're only getting one position for the sun. We could rotate the HDRI and that will rotate our shadows to get different effects, but I'd rather have control left with the sun, which can then have soft shadows on the sun, and have the ambient light generated by the HDRI. To achieve that, go into the Skylab and turn the sun moon off as a visible object. Go into image-based lighting, select Sky Dome only because we only need light sources in the upper half of the sky. We don't need any under the ground. Use Sky, and there we go. We've got our Sky Dome, and now we can have the sun back in and mix the two. I'm going to reduce the intensity of the sun but I am going to give some soft shadows. So I'll try 15 to start with, and then I'm going to increase the intensity of our HDRI, so that's providing some of the light there, and then balance these two effects together. So I think I'm going to need a bit more sun, and we'll have a look how that looks now, because I've got to bear in mind that the alien's eyes are white. So just plop render that bit, that's looking white. We're getting a bit of soft shadows on there, not that excessive, but then again it doesn't want to be. I could probably go further than that. I'll try 25, because the soft shadows themselves establish scale for us, and there's more sophisticated ambient lighting occurring there. Right, where should I put my sun? And I could have the sun casting a nice shadow from this structure along the ground towards the camera, and that you can see now this is the soft shadows getting softer as it's coming towards us. And here we've got our man here. This is telling us that the sun's quite low on the horizon, and I can see from this that it's probably a bit too soft, so I'll reduce that again. You've got to be very careful with this soft shadow setting when dealing with large objects. The other thing to do is to consider what our field of view wants to be. Now, if you remember back when I was doing the test to see what 120 degrees was, I said it was 145 field of view for Bryce, which puts us in quite an extreme field of view situation here, which is interesting. So I can move my camera forward, and you can see proportionally the alien's moving forward more than this thing in the background. And so hopefully by combining all these things together, we can establish, just from the effects of the lighting alone and the haze, that this is a big thing in the distance and that our alien is in the foreground. And as you can see, that's not really taking very long to render. The AA pass is probably going to take a little bit longer because of the noise in this shadow region. So while that's rendering, we'll take a look at the other one we set going a few minutes ago. Okay, well that's rendered out, but something a little bit curious has occurred along this edge here as a result of combining depth of field effect with true ambience effect. So that spoiled things a little bit. So we'll just see if we can fix that using a technique which involves a distance mask instead. So I'll just show you how to find where distance mask is. Render options, we'll switch back to regular and we'll choose distance mask. I'll check out of that. Now if I render it now, you'll see we can barely see anything in this scene, and that's because the distance mask has scaled to the largest object in the scene, which is this obscure light source which I've wrapped around my scene. So if I get rid of that and render again, that'll produce us a distance mask pretty quickly. So I'll just export that image as, got one here, distance mask, there we go. Yep. And then we'll render the scene as it was before, so I'll just quickly reload that, but without the depth of field effect. So we'll keep the true ambience effect, so render option, we'll keep soft shadows as well, and we'll get rid of depth of field and just re-render that now, and I'll combine these two in a paint package. Right, so here's the version without depth of field but with true ambience and soft shadows, and I'm going to try and use Paint Shop Pro to set my mask up as I have in the other video if you want to check that out. But essentially I just need to process this, so I've got strong contrast between where I want things to be in focus. So this could be like dark. I can always invert the mask to get things right anyway, and this bit to be light, and perhaps other bits to be light as well. So I'm going to adjust and use this curves control here. I'll reset it from what it was set at last. I'm going to add a point and lift it up and see where that puts me. So I need the contrast, so I'm going to bring that one down. And then if I move this high point around, you can see what gets light, like so. So these points here, I can add more points to create a sharper focus area. So at the moment, these bits are probably going to be in focus and these other bits out of focus where they're dark. And that's going to be my mask. Not quite sure why that edge is getting picked out so sharply there. That's interesting. Must be just on some transition. So if I adjust and blur, because I don't want any high bits of noise in there, that'll get rid of any highlights on there really, and then I can go and use this as my mask. So I'm bringing my one that I rendered without depth of field effect, and then go layers, new mask layer from image, go OK, promote it to a layer, and pick out the mask and go OK, you can see that these bits are going to be sharp. Now if I look in the, I'll bring this over to where the layers are here. That's my main image. So if I go and copy this image, so I'd just duplicate and then drag it past this main group, and then drag the group over the top of it, then select this background image now and do effects, no, adjust blur and Gaussian blur, and then I can choose the level of blur. You can see that we're blurring parts of this image and not other parts because the other bit's sharp and laid over the top. So I go OK like that, and so we've got a nice soft blur here, but it's sharp where our alien is, though there's a little bit of a soft blur around the outside because of where of what was in that image when it got blurred. So I might have had to mask out parts of that, but as I say, this process is covered in other tutorials and you can work it out for yourself really, because it's using a paint package. But that's a way of getting around the problem with the true ambience. So hopefully I've managed to improve that slightly over my other image, and really when it comes to setting these things up, it's you know, it's the details that count. You can see there is a bit of an odd edge on that. That's the one with the depth of field, and so we'll say that one's done. So if I'll save copy as, that one's finished. Yes, we'll just compress the image down. Okay, so that was a bit tricky. Let's have a look how our large scale image came out. That's not that one, that's that one. Right, that rendered out in fairly short time because we're using image-based lighting and direct lighting, and I hope you can see that that looks like quite a large structure in the distance being swallowed by the haze on this rather bland alien planet. We've got a tiny bit of shadow banding visible around here, but if this a texture was put on this floor, then you would lose sight of that, and then you've just got the effect of the softening of the shadow as it comes towards you. So that's the small scale and the large scale handled as far as lighting is concerned. It got a little bit more involved than I imagined, but you know, that's what happened. Right, the next step in this then is combining these elements with geometric composition. So now we're going to start looking at the image, even though we're looking at it as a 3D object, and we've been thinking about that and the scale of these things. When we got to the point of setting our camera up, the next thing is, what about the shapes that are appearing on the screen? How do they affect the composition? What do they tell us about it? And where should we put things when we're moving the camera around? I mean, we're dictated to by wanting to create a sense of scale, whether that be small or large. These are all considerations. I mean, with abstract, you could throw all that out the window and do what you like. You can still consider the geometric composition of abstracts, but if we're dealing with things like portraits or vast terrain landscapes, there are still things you can do compositionally, choices you can make, even though you're dictated to by lighting and the field of view and the depth of field and where your horizon is. There are still things you can do to make changes to the composition to improve your final image that are based purely on the shapes that are being thrown up on your screen. So that's the next part of this tutorial.